Europe is visibly gearing up for a possible war with Russia. NATO is already urging all member states to boost their defense spending up to 5% of their gross domestic products by the year 2035, and leaders across the continent are sending clear signals to Vladimir Putin that they are preparing for a confrontation and intend to be ready if and when Russia decides to escalate into open conflict. Yet there is one crucial thing that many of these governments do not yet seem to grasp, and many ordinary Europeans may not have realized either. Russia is not just preparing for a future war with Europe. According to a growing number of analysts, Russia is already at war with Europe right now. The problem is that this war looks very different from the traditional picture of tanks crossing borders and missiles raining down on capital cities, so most people have not recognized it as such. One of the clearest voices explaining this is George Barros, an analyst at the Institute for the Study of War. In a recent interview with Lithuania's public broadcaster LRT, published on the 13th of November, Barros laid out his view of what Russia is doing and unpacked a phrase he has been using for some time, the term phase zero. In his telling, phase zero is not some vague metaphor, it is the first deliberate stage of a war that Russia has already initiated against Europe. LRT highlighted specific examples of what this phase looks like in practice, from waves of drones entering European airspace to strange contraband balloons floating into Lithuania and disrupting airport operations. When LRT asked Barros directly whether these sorts of incidents fit into what he calls Phase Zero, he replied that they absolutely do, and then went on to explain how Phase Zero works in Russian and Soviet-style military doctrine. In that doctrine, as in other modern military thinking, you do not simply flip a switch and start a war from one day to the next. Long before the first shots are fired, there is an extended period in which the battlefield is prepared. Barros describes Phase Zero as precisely this stage. It is the informational, political, and psychological conditioning that sets the stage for a larger war Russia might one day wage against Europe and NATO. In other words, it is about laying the foundations now for a full-scale conflict that may only erupt years later. Attempts at intimidation and constant probing of weaknesses are central to this phase, which is where all of those drone flights and balloon incursions come in. They are designed both to test how the targeted countries respond and to send a message that Russia is watching, mapping vulnerabilities, and quietly putting in place the assets it would need to strike them whenever Putin and his circle decide the time has come. Barros points out that Russia has strong motives for launching Phase Zero, many of which revolve around the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. He often finds himself having to convince Western colleagues that Russia still has geopolitical and territorial ambitions in the Baltic region, which the Kremlin likes to describe as historically Russian land, part of the old Russian Empire or the broader Russian world. At the same time, Moscow is seeking to fundamentally rewrite the security architecture of Europe in its favor. This is not just abstract rhetoric. Back in the autumn of 2021, Russia's Directorate for International Relations and Cultural Contacts with Foreign Countries produced a set of secret documents for the Kremlin, later exposed by LRT in May 2023, that spelled out how Moscow viewed the Baltic states and what it wanted to do about them. The documents were divided into two parts. The first outlined perceived threats to Russian interests in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The second recommended specific political, social, and even military actions to counter those threats and strengthen Russian influence, ultimately aiming at regaining control over countries that once belonged to the Soviet bloc. The Baltic states themselves are under no illusions about these ambitions. In March, BBC Europe editor Katja Adler published an article describing how Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are trying to make themselves as resistant to Putin's pressure as possible, a process she calls Putin-proofing. She notes that Russia is already using many of the tools that fit Barros's definition of Phase Zero, especially along Estonia's border. There, Russia has deployed thermal imaging buoys in the Narva River, which forms a natural frontier between the two countries, and has been conducting constant GPS jamming in the area. All of this forms part of a broader campaign to intimidate and psychologically toy with a much smaller neighbor. Estonia has responded by hardening its stance. Along with Lithuania and Poland, it has asked to withdraw from the international convention, banning anti-personnel landmines, signaling that these countries are so worried about Russian aggression that they want the legal option of mining their borders if Moscow ever attempts a ground invasion. When you put these strands together, what emerges is not a series of random incidents but a coordinated campaign. Barros argues that Russia's Phase Zero is not a loose collection of improvisations, it is an officially named operation that is already in progress. These activities did not simply appear out of nowhere. Somewhere within the Kremlin or the Russian General Staff, someone issued orders to begin a systematic program of reconnaissance, provocations, and experiments. That program includes testing how to shut down airports in multiple countries at once, scouting military sites, and provoking air defense responses, all while gathering data on how Europe reacts. Every one of these actions serves a larger plan, which Barros calls Phase 1, the kinetic phase. That is the stage when the shooting starts, when Russia might try to hit first and hit hard, assuming it still retains enough military power after its war in Ukraine. There is also another possible path. Instead of going straight into open war, Russia might use the pressure it has built up during Phase 0 to present Europe or NATO with a series of demands. For example, to stop further NATO expansion. If those demands are met, Moscow could temporarily roll back to a quieter version of Phase 0 or pause its escalation. If they are rejected, that could be the trigger for the kinetic war that the Kremlin has been preparing for years. The fact that this war has not yet turned into full-scale conventional combat between Russia and NATO does not mean Russia is not already acting as if it is at war with Europe. The most obvious sign is that Russian officials themselves are saying so, though always in their characteristic distorted fashion. During a briefing with Russian journalists on the 15th of September, Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov delivered a now infamous comment. As reported by the Kyiv Independent, he declared that NATO is at war with Russia, insisted that this is obvious and needs no proof, and accused NATO countries of providing direct and indirect support to what he called the Kyiv regime. As so often with Russian propaganda, there is a grain of truth wrapped in layers of lies. It is true that NATO countries are supporting Ukraine. What Peskov deliberately omits is that this support exists only because Russia launched an illegal invasion of its neighbor in the first place. Comments like these work on two levels. Externally, they are meant to intimidate Europe by framing any support for Ukraine as an act of war against Russia. Internally, they are aimed at ordinary Russians, conditioning them psychologically for a future in which they might be mobilized to fight NATO in Europe. The Kremlin has no problem using wartime information tactics against its own citizens, and propaganda remains one of Putin's most powerful tools. Since Peskov made those statements, Russia has ramped up its accusations against NATO's European members. On the 8th of October, France 24 reported that Moscow is now accusing Poland, the United Kingdom, and the European Union of organizing false flag operations to frame Russia for acts of sabotage, which, according to the Kremlin, are actually being carried out by the supposed victims themselves. One particularly bizarre allegation claimed that British authorities were recruiting Ukrainian agents to stage a naval attack that would appear to have been carried out by Russia. In this fever dream scenario, Ukrainian fighters would be pulled away from a war in which their country needs every willing soldier, then equipped with Chinese gear so that Beijing could also be implicated, and finally arrested by Western agents who would present them as Russian proxies. Western officials have understandably dismissed all of this as nonsense, and there is no evidence to support the Russian claims. Yet even such obviously fabricated stories fit the Phase 0 mindset. They mirror the kind of covert operation Russia itself might run, and they are designed to plant seeds of doubt among European allies, making it harder for them to trust each other and cooperate effectively if and when Phase 1 begins. At the same time, we can see that Russia's hybrid war on Europe is not limited to words and narratives. There is a growing body of physical evidence. We have already mentioned some of the aerial incursions into European airspace, which Barros points to as clear signs that Russia has moved into Phase 0. In the last few months, Belgium has become a particular focus. On the 11th of November, the Telegraph reported that in the preceding 2 weeks, waves of unidentified drones had been spotted over Belgian airports, military bases, and even nuclear power plants. Security officials are deeply concerned because there is no benign reason for drones to appear repeatedly over such sensitive sites. 5 drones were seen above the Doel nuclear power station in a single day on the 9th of November. Belgium's allies have taken the situation seriously enough that France, Germany, and the United Kingdom have all pledged to send specialized counter-drone units to help deal with the problem. These Belgian incidents are only the latest in a broader aerial campaign that really picked up pace in early September, when Russia sent 21 drones into Polish airspace, forcing Warsaw to scramble fighter jets. Shortly afterward, Estonia, already contending with thermal buoys and GPS interference, had to respond to a formation of 3 Russian MiG-31 aircraft that violated its airspace, lingered for 12 minutes, and ignored all attempts at communication. From Russia's perspective, such flights showcase its military capabilities and probe NATO defenses, all while staying just below the threshold of an armed clash. Nor are these the only examples. The Telegraph has also reported that Sweden began noticing mysterious drone activity just as it was weighing a decision to supply 150 Gripen fighter jets to Ukraine, an odd coincidence that looks a lot like pressure from Moscow. In Denmark, much of October was marked by drones repeatedly disrupting airports and other critical infrastructure. Norway has had its own problems with drone flights targeting its airfields. Germany's military sites have also seen suspicious drone activity, and airports in several European countries have been affected. Taken together, there are now dozens of reported incidents of this kind scattered across the continent. Only one state has both the means and the strategic motivation to orchestrate such a large-scale pattern of harassment and reconnaissance. This is exactly the kind of psychological preparation and information warfare that Barros associates with Phase Zero. It is hybrid war, a step short of open kinetic conflict, yet unmistakably hostile in intent. Some Western figures with long experience dealing with Russia say they clearly recognize what is happening. George Robertson, the former NATO Secretary General who led the alliance from 1999 to 2003, when Putin was first consolidating his power, has spoken out in interviews with the United Kingdom's Channel 4, leaving no doubt that he sees Russia waging a campaign against Europe. Peter Pomerantsev of Johns Hopkins University, another expert quoted by Channel 4, says that the key is to step back and look at the bigger picture. Any single incident may seem minor, just an odd drone sighting here or a GPS glitch there, but when you line up the full pattern, you can see that these small events fit together into a deliberate strategy aligned with Russia's foreign policy goals. Those goals, in his view, include running a Phase Zero-style war across Europe to set the conditions for something much larger that may follow, whether that is a direct attack or an attempt to blackmail Europe into accepting Russian demands. There is more. Since the West began imposing serious sanctions on Russian oil exports after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin has been quietly assembling a so-called shadow fleet of aging tankers. The purpose of this fleet is to carry Russian oil around the world while evading scrutiny and restrictions. Because of its clandestine nature, estimates differ, but by the summer of 2025, the European Union had identified 444 vessels as part of this fleet, according to the Center for European Policy Analysis. In February, the Brookings Institution reported that Russia had already spent more than $10 billion building up this fleet, which gives a sense of its size and importance. Most commentary has focused on how the shadow fleet helps Russia to keep earning money for its war machine despite sanctions. Yet there is growing concern that these ships may also be serving as tools for Phase Zero. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in October, as reported by The Guardian, that Russian tankers are being used not only for trade but also for reconnaissance and even sabotage operations. For Zelensky and others, this is yet another sign that Russia's war against Europe is no longer hypothetical. It is underway in slow motion, and the big kinetic phase could arrive sooner than many European leaders are willing to admit. That warning became even starker in mid-November. On the 13th of that month, The Independent quoted Zelensky as saying that Ukraine believes it can push Russia hard enough in the near term that Moscow will need a pause. At the same time, he cautioned that the Kremlin's long-term goal is to prepare for a much larger war on the European continent. In his view, Russia is working toward the ability to launch that big war sometime around the years 2029 or 2030. If Barros is right about what Phase Zero means, Zelensky appears to be one of the few leaders who fully understands the implications and is willing to say so openly. The uncomfortable truth is that the war between Russia and Europe has already begun in this pre-kinetic phase, and it could escalate into something far worse if Europe continues to treat it as a series of isolated irritations rather than the early stages of a major conflict. The question then becomes what Europe is actually doing about it. Earlier we noted that much of the continent still seems half asleep, slow to recognize the scale of what is happening. There has been no shortage of speeches and declarations, especially about improving defense capabilities. NATO's European members have pledged to move towards spending 5% of their gross domestic products on defense, but they have roughly a decade to reach that target under current guidelines. That timetable may be dangerously leisurely if Russia is indeed aiming for a much earlier showdown. In October, the National Security Journal published an article arguing that Europe is not prepared for a long war with Russia on a scale comparable to the one currently raging in Ukraine. The piece cited comments by Norway's finance minister and former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who warned while accepting the NATO Freedom Award in Poland that Europe must urgently build a credible collective defense against the Russian threat. He also lamented that relationships both within the European Union and within NATO remain too fragmented to support the kind of unified effort such a defense would require. Barros shares these frustrations and has his own blunt advice for European governments. First, he says they need to start calling things by their real names. Russian actions that violate the sovereignty of NATO member states should be explicitly labeled as acts of war, not brushed aside as mere provocations or ambiguous incidents. Only when European leaders accept that Russia is already acting as an enemy can they begin to design a coherent response to Phase 0, with the goal of disrupting it before Putin can move on to Phase 1. Whether Europe will reach that level of clarity and resolve is an open question. One thing, however, is not in doubt. Russia will continue to commit acts of war. It is doing so openly in Ukraine, where the ferocity and ingenuity of the Ukrainian response has astonished many in NATO. Few expected Ukraine to mount such an effective military defense. Now that it has, NATO and Europe should be doing everything possible to sustain that effort, because helping Ukraine resist Russia's aggression is also part of defending Europe against the Phase 0 war that is already underway. For more on how Ukraine's resistance is reshaping the strategic balance and forcing NATO to rethink its own assumptions, make sure to watch our other videos and subscribe to the Military Show for ongoing coverage of Russia's escalating campaign against Europe.